And then while you're taking questions, I'll sneak up here and swap out the slides to queue up the next presentation.
Okay, so I'm Abigail, and today I'll be talking about reconnecting urban and regional plant species pools, and specifically the role of hoverflies in doing that. So first, before we get there, let's talk about urban biotic homogenization. We've talked a little bit about this in class, but essentially the big idea is that cities are becoming more homogenized. So they're becoming more like each other and less connected to the regional species pool. The primary cause of this is urbanization and introduction of non-native species. And this can show up in functional, taxonomic, or genetic features. And biotic homogenization really refers to loss of biological diversity in populations or communities. So it's a pretty broad type of a term. So essentially, to summarize again, each city is becoming more like other cities and less like the local region. So you can see from these pictures, if you didn't know where they were taken necessarily, they all look pretty similar. You have lots of introduced turf, lawn, some trees in a city. Looks pretty similar. And just for fun, we'll do one more example of a plant species that represents urban biotic homogenization. So if you look at these crepe myrtles, which picture do you think shows it in its native habitat? And as a hint, crepe myrtles are native to Southeast Asia. So if you guessed none of them, you are correct. So these come from the Southeast, from the West Coast, and all the way in Australia. And they are, to me at least, they're kind of emblematic of this idea of urban biotic homogenization. So looking again at urban biotic homogenization, another aspect of it is not just native and non-native introduced species, but also the idea of disconnection from the local species pool. So because urban habitats are fragmented and isolated from the regional species pool, and there's high matrix or low matrix permeability, urbanization can cause a reduction of gene flow from the urban and rural populations. So this graphic is just showing that in rural areas, there's a greater habitat connectivity and resulting greater gene flow than with an urban area versus a rural area. So how do we go about mitigating the impacts of urban plant biotic homogenization? So first of all, one obvious way to do this is limiting the impacts of non-native plants. So this could include not planting non-native plants, as well as trying to control ones that are invasive. And the one that I'm going to focus on specifically is reconnecting urban and rural plant populations. Of course, there are physical habitat corridor linkages, but there are also linkages through dispersers in pollinators, which we will look a little bit at one specifically. A potential candidate to create this link between urban and rural plant populations is hoverflies. They are efficient pollinators. They're a little bit less sensitive to urbanization than other pollinators like bees, and they can also practice long-range pollen transfer. So, are hoverflies the pollinators of the future? Specifically, we're looking at these two subfamilies that are pretty species-rich that do most of the pollinating. There are some other hoverflies that don't really pollinate, but these two subfamilies as adults do quite a bit of pollinating. It's been found that they're efficient or even more efficient than bees, honeybees at crop pollination. Again, they're less sensitive to the impacts of urbanization. They're generalist pollinators, so they can feed on most any type of flower. And they have a fairly relatively stable population as far as insects go. So looking a little bit at the long distance pollen transfer aspect, hoverfly range in general is a little bit larger than a bee. It can travel for greater distances to find flowers. And then an interesting aspect that I grabbed onto for my research part of it was the idea of hoverfly migration. I didn't know that they migrated before looking into this, but there is a potential link that this could facilitate connection with a larger regional plant species pool from the urban area, particularly bypassing the urban matrix issues. that honeybees and other bees have. So the current research that is going on right now, there's nothing really specifically that I found that looks at hoverflies' role as far as connecting urban and rural populations. But there is research out there, of course, on urban plant biotic homogenization. There is pretty strong evidence at the local city scale. Globally, there's not as much of a consensus that homogenization is happening, but it's acknowledged pretty widely that there's a risk for it. And then hoverfly migration and pollen transfer. Most of the documentation I found was in Europe. There were very few documentation that I found in North America, but I think there's more research being done. Most of the papers I found were like published this year. So that's good to see that more folks are doing research on that. These two graphics are just showing that the two hoverflies in purple can travel farther than other bees and other pollinators would. And then this graphic, this study was from the UK, and this is showing that hoverflies are significant in number, almost about 4 billion or so. It's saying there's some decline there, but it's on par with other bees and other pollinators as far as numbers go. So my proposed research is to understand and see if hoverflies really do reconnect urban populations with the rural species pool. So I made this graphic to kind of illustrate the issues that the urban matrix presents as far as keeping the rural and urban plant populations separate and isolated from each other. So I would look at the individual city scale with replications across several cities, again, from the articles I was reading, it seemed like urban biotic homogenization was most present at the city scale, and then would be comparing hoverfly versus non-hoverfly pollinated plant populations. And as a metric, I would use genetic similarity of plant populations. As a control, I would be looking at the bee pollinated plants that would show minimal linkage to rural species pool, to the rural species pool. So my expected results, if my hypothesis is supported, there would be higher genetic similarity between the urban and rural populations of the hoverfly pollinated plants versus the bee pollinated plants. And if it was not supported, there would be similar or lower genetic similarity between the hoverfly and the bee pollinated plants. One potential roadblock that I identified was that because hoverflies are generalist pollinators, there might be some overlap of what the bees were pollinating. And then for further research, there's a lot more research needed. Again, like I said, I didn't find a lot on this specific topic, some adjacent topics, but nothing that specific. And of course, promoting hoverfly habitat in urban areas through education and using methods that are already in place. And here's some hoverfly pictures.